What if the history you were taught in school is only half the story? What if some of the most important moments in our past were deliberately scrubbed from the record by people in power? We like to think of history as a collection of facts set in stone. But the truth is, the story of humanity has always been a battlefield. It's a narrative that's been shaped, twisted, and often mutilated by emperors, inquisitors, and governments who all understood a simple, profound truth. To control the present, you have to control the past. These aren't just stories about a few banned books. These are about systematic campaigns to annihilate ideas, cultures, and entire chapters of the human experience. We're going from the bonfires of ancient China to the digital battlegrounds of the modern world, uncovering what the powerful feared most and the extraordinary lengths they went to in order to control what we think we know. These are the stories they didn't want you to know. The Great Unreading. Qin Shi Huang's War on Thought. Our story begins over 2,200 years ago in a newly unified China under its very first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. We know him for the Great Wall and that incredible terracotta army built to protect him in the afterlife. But while he was busy building monuments, he was also orchestrating one of the most audacious acts of censorship in history, a systematic effort to erase any thought that didn't align with his own. Before Qin Shi Huang, China was a patchwork of warring states, but it was also experiencing a golden age of philosophy. This was the era of the 100 schools of thought where thinkers like Confucius and his followers debated morality, government, and the universe. It was a chaotic, brilliant marketplace of ideas. But for an emperor obsessed with absolute control, this intellectual diversity wasn't a strength. It was a threat. His prime minister, Li Si, was a hardcore follower of a philosophy called legalism, which argued that the state's power must be absolute. He saw scholars and their books, with their endless debates and critiques of the present, as a direct challenge to the emperor. Li Si's advice was chillingly simple: to silence all criticism, you must burn the past. In 213 BC, the emperor issued a decree. All books of history and philosophy from the old states were to be gathered and burned. Poetry and history were seen as especially dangerous because they allowed people to compare Qin Shi Huang's rule to that of supposedly better rulers from the past. The only books spared were practical manuals on farming, medicine, and divination, along with the official history of the Qin state. Just like that, centuries of wisdom were condemned to the flames. The goal was to make history begin with him. The purge didn't stop with books. A year later, the emperor took his next terrifying step. According to the later Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian, Qin Shi Huang ordered the execution of around 460 scholars in the capital. While modern historians debate whether they were literally buried alive, as the story claims, there's little doubt that scholars who defied the emperor were killed. The message couldn't be clearer. Not only were unapproved ideas illegal, but the people who held them would be eliminated. The impact was devastating. The book burning effectively neutered China's rich philosophical heritage, leaving legalism as the only ideology allowed. A huge amount of history was lost forever, creating gaps in our knowledge of ancient China that scholars still struggle with today. Though copies of some books were kept in the Imperial Library, many of those were destroyed in fires when the dynasty fell, sealing the loss. Qin Shi Huang's reign was short, but his war on knowledge was a terrifying success. He proved a principle that tyrants would copy for centuries. The easiest way to win an argument is to burn your opponent's books and bury their scholars. The fire of faith, the Spanish Inquisition's purge of knowledge. Next, we head to 15th century Spain, a land at a cultural crossroads. For centuries, the Iberian Peninsula had been a place where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities lived together, creating a vibrant, if sometimes tense, intellectual world. But as the Catholic monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, finished their Reconquista and consolidated power, their dream of a unified Catholic Spain took a very dark turn. The target wasn't just people, but the very knowledge they held sacred. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, is infamous for its brutality, torture, and public executions. While its main goal was to hunt down heretics, especially Jewish and Muslim converts suspected of practicing their old faiths in secret, this mission quickly grew into a full-blown assault on culture and literature. The men behind the Inquisition, like the fanatical Grand Inquisitor Tomás de Torquemada, knew that identity is preserved in texts. To truly erase a people, you had to erase their books. The campaign hit a fever pitch in Granada, the last Muslim kingdom, which fell in 1492. In 1499, a powerful cardinal named Jiménez de Cisneros arrived, unhappy with the slow pace of conversions. He ordered the collection of countless priceless Arabic manuscripts, books on philosophy, science, poetry, and theology. These weren't seen as treasures of human knowledge, but as worthless heresy. In a huge, symbolic act of dominance, an estimated 4,000 to 5,000 Arabic manuscripts were publicly burned in Granada's main square. It was a spectacle meant to terrorize and humiliate the city's Muslim population, a declaration that their culture had no place in the new Spain. This destruction wasn't just aimed at Arabic texts. The Inquisition also burned Hebrew literature across the kingdom in the years leading up to 1500. For a culture that reveres the written word, this was an act of profound violence. Burning a Torah scroll is considered a desecration of the highest order. The Inquisition's bonfires consumed the recorded soul of a people who had lived in Spain for over 1,000 years. But knowledge is a stubborn thing. In the face of this cultural war, a new form of literature was born. Al-Jamiado. Muslims who had been forced to convert, known as Moriscos, began writing in Spanish but using the familiar Arabic script. It was a secret, subversive act of preservation, a way to keep their identity alive when the world wanted it gone. They hid these texts in the walls and roofs of their homes, creating secret libraries that are still being discovered today. The Inquisition's book burnings were a clear attempt to sever a people from their heritage and create a kind of cultural amnesia. It's a grim reminder that the battle for ideological purity is often waged with fire, and its first casualty is always knowledge. One man's morality, Anthony Comstock's American Crusade. Censorship isn't always the work of empires or states. Sometimes it's driven by the fanatical vision of one determined person. Now we go to late 19th and early 20th century America to meet a man who believed it was his personal mission to cleanse the nation of vice, Anthony Comstock. His name became so linked with prudish censorship that people invented a word for it, Comstockery. Comstock was a Civil War veteran and a devout Christian, horrified by what he saw as the moral decay of post-war America. He was obsessed with obscene literature, a category which to him included not just pornography, but any information about sex, reproduction, or even art with nudity. He saw these things as tools of the devil designed to corrupt the youth. And he wasn't just some concerned citizen, he was a man on a mission. In 1873, Comstock went to Washington, D.C., and with the help of powerful allies, single-handedly lobbied Congress to pass a sweeping federal law. The Comstock Act became one of the most powerful tools of censorship in American history. It made it illegal to send any obscene, lewd, or lascivious material through the mail, and crucially, the law's definition of obscene explicitly included any information about contraception or abortion. But Comstock didn't just create the law, he became its enforcer. Appointed as a special agent of the US Post Office, he had the authority to open mail, seize materials, and arrest people. He carried a revolver and pursued his targets with terrifying zeal. By the end of his life, he boasted of being responsible for thousands of arrests and the destruction of an incredible amount of indecent material, claiming to have burned 15 tons of books and nearly 300,000 pounds of the printing plates used to make them. His targets were varied. He went after publishers of cheap novels, early feminists advocating for free love, and anyone who dared to share information about family planning. One of his most famous targets was Margaret Sanger, the pioneering nurse who fought to legalize birth control. Comstock's crusade forced Sanger to flee to Europe to avoid prosecution for her articles on contraception. His actions essentially criminalized any public discussion of reproductive health for decades. Even medical textbooks were seized if Comstock decided they were too explicit. Comstock's campaign was a different kind of censorship, born not of political ideology, but of a moral panic, weaponized by one man's iron will. He wasn't a dictator, but he used the machinery of a democracy to impose his personal moral code on the entire country. The Comstock Act's legacy was long and damaging, stifling free speech and severely restricting women's access to basic health information for nearly a century. It's a powerful lesson in how the fervent beliefs of a few can be used to silence the many. The official mind. The US Office of Censorship in WW2. When we think of censorship, we usually picture totalitarian regimes, not the United States. But during World War II, America implemented one of the largest and most effective censorship operations the world has ever seen. It was a complex system that shows how even democracies will sacrifice freedoms for national security. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 19, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an executive order creating the U.S. Office of Censorship. As FDR himself put it, all Americans abhor censorship, but some degree of censorship is essential in wartime. He smartly appointed Byron Price, a respected Associated Press journalist, to lead the office, which helped get the press on board. The office's power was huge. It could censor all communications entering or leaving the US. Every letter, telegram, and radio broadcast was fair game. At its peak, the office employed over 14,000 people to scour personal mail for any hint of information that could help the enemy. Inside the US, the system was technically voluntary. The office gave newspapers and radio stations a code of wartime practices, which was a detailed list of what not to report. The list was long. No details on troop movements, ship sailings, new weapons, or even the weather. Weather forecasts were especially sensitive. As they could help enemy bombers or submarines, the rules could be almost comical. In one case, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt herself was censored after writing in her column about the weather where she was visiting. She got a very stern letter and had to promise her readers she wouldn't mention if the sun was shining anymore. For the most part, the American press willingly complied. The propaganda slogan, "Loose lips sink ships," was a constant reminder of the life and death stakes. The biggest success of this censorship was the almost total media blackout around the Manhattan Project. For years, thousands of journalists knew a massive secret project was happening, but almost nothing was printed about the atomic bomb until after it was dropped. But the office was also used for political convenience. Censors restricted photos of President Roosevelt that showed his reliance on a wheelchair, helping to hide the extent of his disability from the public during his 1944 re-election campaign. This wasn't about national security, it was about political image management. The story of the US Office of Censorship is a fascinating look at the tension between freedom and security. It shows that when faced with a massive threat, democratic governments are also willing to control information, drawing a blurry line between protecting the nation and manipulating the public. The ashes of a culture, the destruction of Sarajevo's National Library. Our final story is one of the most heartbreaking acts of cultural destruction in modern history. It shows censorship in its most brutal form, not just silencing dissent, but erasing a people's entire identity. This is the story of the 1992 firebombing of the National Library in Sarajevo. The library, housed in a beautiful historic building called the Vijećnica, was the heart and soul of Sarajevo. It was a proud symbol of the city's long multicultural history, where Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian and Slavic influences had mixed for centuries. Inside were over 1.5 million volumes, including more than 155,000 rare books and unique manuscripts that documented the shared history of the region's Muslims, Serbs, Croats, and Jews. But in the early 1990s, as Yugoslavia tore itself apart, this symbol of unity became a target. During the brutal siege of Sarajevo, Bosnian Serb forces shelled the city from the hills. On the night of August 25, 1992, they aimed their artillery at the Vijećnica. The building had no military value. It was deliberately targeted with incendiary shells in an act of cultural genocide, an attempt to erase Bosnia's history from existence. As the fire raged, a small group of librarians and citizens risked their lives, running into the inferno under a hail of sniper fire. They formed a human chain, passing books hand to hand out of the burning building. One librarian, Aida Buturovic, was killed trying to save the treasures she had dedicated her life to. But their heroism could only do so much. The library burned for 3 days. Nearly 90% of its collection was turned to ash. An estimated 1.5 million books were lost forever, including 700 irreplaceable manuscripts and 100 years of journals and newspapers. The fires consumed centuries of Bosnian history, folk songs, and literature. Some have called it the largest single book burning in history. A photo from the aftermath shows the grand, empty shell of the building, the floor blanketed in a thick layer of grey ash, the physical remains of a nation's memory. In a now iconic act of defiance, the cellist Vedran Smailovic went to the ruins of the library and played Albinoni's Adagio for 22 straight days, one for each person killed in a massacre at a breadline. His mournful music, echoing through the burned-out hall, was a protest against the erasure of a civilization. The destruction of the Sarajevo Library was a horrifying reminder that the most extreme censorship isn't just banning a book, it's destroying the library that holds it. It was an attack on the very idea that different cultures can coexist. The building was painstakingly rebuilt and reopened in 2014, but its soul, the collection, can never be replaced. The ashes in Sarajevo are a permanent scar, a testament to the fact that sometimes the goal of censorship isn't just to control history, but obliterate it. Conclusion. From the imperial fires of Qinshi Huang to the ashes of Sarajevo's library, the pattern is undeniable. Throughout history, those who seek absolute power have always seen knowledge as their enemy. They burn books, silence scholars, and rewrite history not from a place of strength, but from a place of fear. They're afraid of an inconvenient fact, a rival idea, and most of all, they're afraid of a public that can think for itself, ask questions and remember a different version of the story. As the methods have evolved. The bonfire has been replaced by the censor's digital blue pencil, and the burning of libraries by the coordinated suppression of information online. But the impulse is exactly the same. Control the narrative. These stories aren't just tragic footnotes. They're warnings. They prove that our collective memory is fragile and that the struggle to preserve it is a constant, necessary fight. The very survival of these stories is a testament to the resilience of truth. It reminds us that while you can burn books and destroy libraries, it's much, much harder to kill an idea. The question these moments leave us with is this: how do we make sure that history isn't written only by the winners, but by all of us?